Thank you, Jérôme. Thank you for having me. Because I'm not a scientist, really. I'm an architect, as Jérôme said. And maybe a few words to understand why I have been interested in the critical zone science. It's because when I was doing projects for urban planning or landscape territorial strategy design, I felt that we miss something about the dynamics of the landscapes. And that we oversimplified in a way the way we look at landscape. So that's why I have been interested in the critical zone science and in the observatories, because they, in a way, they renew our understanding of landscape and their dynamics. And because I am an architect, I also use tools, mostly maps, to do a project. And so, because of this research, I also develop a kind of tool, or I call it a model, but it's basically this kind of drawing, a graphic tool to try to map the landscape of the critical zone. I will try to discuss with you how this model can be applied to different interdisciplinary research questions and varies according to the aims that we have on each project. So the question is how, starting from the same model, which defines here a system of potential coordinates for the critical zone, variations and evolution of this model have been possible over the course of interdisciplinary meeting and research context that I will present here. Donc, from the same object, this model, how it is possible to work on it and adapt it to different questions with different methods that leads to alternative cartographic variations. And this raises a set of questions that we'll try to answer. So first, how does a map become an object that circulates and changes according to where and with whom it circulates? And secondly, how could the map be conceived as a constructed tool to address issues of visualization of the Earth or territories, crossing disciplines such as architecture, planning, history of science, geochemistry, geology, philosophy of science, and ethnography of the moderns? So that it questions also the status of the map. Is it a boundary object, or is it an intermediate object, or a cosmogram, according to Tresch? So the following presentation gives a kind of explanation of this co-construction, with whom, and for what each map have been done, and how did the model evolve. So the first version of the model was developed after discussions with Bruno Latour and Jérôme Gaillardet. It led to a paper in the Anthropocene Review that some of you may know, called Given Depth to the Surface, an exercise in the geography of the critical zone. For Bruno Latour, the image of the globe was not a good referential to understand the Earth, and so we should develop new cartographic systems so as to better see this thin layer of the Earth called the critical zone in its depth, but also the phenomenon and living beings which cross and sustain it. So we came up with a gesture aiming at reversing the globe, so putting the atmosphere in the center, rocks on the periphery so that the Earth is enclosed. And then we design a kind of grammar of spirals to visualize the biochemical cycles, which give also a kind of infinity of this Earth. One of the key questions was also to visualize the place of human in the cycles. Are they do they bifurcate the cycle, disturb it, increase some of them or decrease other cycles, like with the carbon cycle, for example. And I will just show you a short video so that we also did a video afterwards the paper in the purpose to show it to the public who is not familiar to the concept, and it was shown at the ZKM exhibition in Karlsruhe. So this is the reversal gesture, and then the different biogeochemical what we wanted, we aim to draw maybe in the future work. So the aim of this first version was to discuss the representation of the critical zone within the scientific community by defining a coordinate system specific for the critical zone observatories, based on how to map the biogeochemical cycles and to integrate the different energetic contribution, that is solar or the deep earth. Then the second version of this model was developed with the book Terraforma, Manuel de cartographie potentielle, or a book of speculative maps in English version, with Frédéric Aitouati, who is a historian of science, and Axel Grégoire, an architect like me. You see in the book there is some pages, a kind of manual, how you made the model and then how you can apply it to different territory in a map. And for this book, the purpose was slightly different than for the scientists, because it was aiming at architects mostly, or artists. And so here, what was important to visualize are the entities, the different entities in the ground. So are they hosted objects introduced by human activities, or are they inhabitant entities, that is native entity what we can find in the ground? So there are also questions of scales of this entity. We wanted to be non-hierarchical, and so being able to visualize then all of them, and the depth also of each side. Then we developed this model further in workshop with art, architectural, and design students at different schools. We made for that different protocols designed according to workshop time and number of people. I will not detail them because we ask different questions, but it's the same model. And we just see some of the results, and we see that it's very different depending of each person during the process of appropriation of the model. So this evolution of the model was also an object for use by third parties, a manual, and educational and training support. Then a fourth evolution of the model appeared when, during my PhD dissertation in Manchester in architecture, where I used STS method and ethnographic observations to follow the scientists of the critical zone in the field, in the observatories. And the question of my PhD, just to frame a little bit, is how their research impacts the way we understand landscape, and how it defines differently the soil, the rivers, the atmosphere, all the components of landscape and its dynamics. And one of the most important goals was to visualize the sensors, the instruments, and what they allow to see and understand about here the Strember Critical Zone Observatory. This is a map. Because the instruments imply a change of focus, a change of gaze. And I will show this short video, which is basically the map detail in how we made the map. So where is it located? When we deploy this site and rebuild it around the model. And here we introduce also an evolution of the structure of the map to include slopes. So this is also topographic understanding. And then the different depths, specifically for this observatory. And then we map how each instrument first function, and then what they allow to see. So it's also a bit simplified, comparing of scientific results. But it's not the same purpose. So why also to do better visualization, better representation of the depth and complexity of the zone, of the entities that compose it and the instruments that allow them to see, because it made possible to take into account a site, for example, in the case of a territorial project, from the perspective of the critical zone and with all that this entails. That is the attention to cycles, the soil depth, the atmosphere, which is not currently the case or is partially the case in our project. And to plan a territory, to define their orientations, we use maps. And these maps reflect a certain conception of the world, basically a colonial system, and also a view from nowhere called objective, but it's all the history of cartography. And so the challenge is to change the codes in order to change practices. This work specifically for my PhD opened a research topic on socio-technical mapping, that is mapping the practices and the technical apparatus needed to observe the critical zone. And eventually it shows that the boundary object is actually the observatory itself, where different scientific disciplines study the same place. So this is a Stramba. Some of you may know. So this is just one more instrument. It's a river lab, yes. Yeah, and we thank a lot of partners and scientists and now another version used with the model is a work we developed a cycle visualization system with Marie-Claire Pierret, geochemist in charge of the Critical Zone Observatory of Stramba. We use a template summarizing the steps to draw the map, the one of the version 1, in order to visualize the sulfur cycle with data from the observatory over the last 30 years. And for the purpose of the exhibition, again, at the ZKM, we animate these cycles. And these are more objects for public exhibition to make them understand what is a critical zone observatory and how scientists study the Earth and its changes. Yeah, I'm not commenting the data because it's complicated for me. But it was really drawn with Marie-Claire. And then we see the decrease in the sulfur contribution in the system, but still new emission also coming from, Another version was new evolution of this model during a workshop at the IPGP with 6 geophysical and geochemical scientists. And here the objective was to define what could be a critical zone observatory in a urban environment. Here again, for the workshop, we use an empty template on which everyone is allowed to draw, following a set of specifically prepared questions to achieve this objective. I will not also go in details. But we use question and drawings at the same time. And then we analyzed the transcription of the workshop, and we could extract 3 interesting points. First, the place of the River Seine became central, so it was not only a soil map, but now a river map. But the river is seen differently depending on the various practices of the scientists. So it was also interesting to try to draw these different variations. like you see on the right. It also modifies the structure of the model, that now we introduce a reading direction from upstream to downstream in a counterclockwise direction. And we had also to draw important movements of the tracers, of the sediments, and of the water flow. So how can we show this on the map? And so the result of the research question regarding what the instrumentation could be to study the critical zone in an urban environment is that we could imagine an instrumented building specifically constructed to monitor, for example, the run of water, the zinc cycle, or the cement cycle, and so on. And this should be published and discussed, but we don't, because it's a work in process. But one interesting methodological finding for the workshop is also that the proposal of an alternative cartographic model puts everyone on the same level and questions. And so it also releases the imagination, allows one to talk about one research from another perspective, to formulate the research questions differently to open a dialogue. In direct continuation of his work, we also developed this map with a commission from the Institut Paris Région for an exhibition, which aimed at visualizing the region Île-de-France soils and subsoils. And here the map integrates the interviews we conducted with planning actors such as quarry managers of gypsum quarry or alluvial deposits, and it raises issues related to exploitation and risk such as physical holes, displacement of land, controversial shortage of materials. So the map here appears more as a critical summary of the interviews and practices related to exploitation of subsoil for the public of the Biennale of Architecture and Landscape. We then have a discussion workshop around the map, which more about a collection of concerns about which soil to defend. And the objective was to identify what is missing to know about the soil for knowing the soil in Île-de-France and the practices that are carried out on or within it. And so the map here appears as an object of debate, allowing the circulation of information between the people involved. New objective, donc really new objective for this model will be to use visualization of biogeochemical cycles of an observatory in the perspective of a territorial planning with architects, scientists, and public authorities. So how also do the sensors deployed in the critical zone observatory gives a better understanding of these cycles, and how can they be visualized to explain then to stakeholders and decision makers who are not used to understanding a territory in this way, in the way of the cycles. And the last objective also will be to add to the Terraforma project maps of sensor. But maybe I will talk about it later. And I just finished to show some images of the ZKM exhibition in Karlsruhe, where we reconstruct an observatory in the space of the museum. Jérôme showed some images this morning, where we can also work on an object that is architectural, and which is complementary to maps. And just a few words to conclude about the maps. These maps that I presented are necessarily unfinished, in constant evolution, because we don't know what the map will look like before doing it, depending on context, collaborators, and aims. And thank you.